What if everything you thought you knew about the origins of Christianity was incomplete? What if the most sacred story in human history had been deliberately edited, with crucial chapters removed and hidden away? According to the Ascension of Isaiah, the prophet witnessed Christ's descent through the seven heavens in disguise, his birth from the Virgin Mary, and his earthly ministry from a heavenly perspective. Most remarkably, Isaiah saw the cosmic significance of the crucifixion, not just as a sacrifice for human sin, but as the decisive battle in a war between divine and demonic forces that had been raging since the fall of the Watchers described in the Book of Enoch. Some scholars have compared these Ethiopian texts to the Gnostic Gospels discovered at Nag Hammadi, but the comparison reveals crucial differences. While Gnostic texts often portrayed the material world as inherently evil and emphasized escape from physical existence, the Ethiopian texts affirmed the goodness of creation while acknowledging its corruption by supernatural evil. Christ came not to help souls escape the world, but to restore the world to its original divine purpose. The influence of these suppressed texts permeates Ethiopian Orthodox worship and theology. Prayers reference events described in the books of Adam and Eve. Liturgical ceremonies incorporate imagery from the Testament of Abraham. Sermons draw on the cosmic perspective provided by the Ascension of Isaiah. For Ethiopian Christians, these aren't alternative or supplementary texts. They're integral parts of the biblical revelation. Today, as Ethiopian monasteries work to preserve and digitize their ancient manuscripts, scholars are gaining unprecedented access to complete versions of texts that exist elsewhere only in fragments. The implications for biblical scholarship are profound. These Ethiopian manuscripts preserve not just individual books, but entire theological traditions that were edited out of other forms of Christianity. Dr. Michael Stone of Hebrew University, a leading expert on these texts, observes, "The Ethiopian tradition preserved complete works that we knew only from fragments or references in other ancient sources. They're giving us access to forms of early Christianity that we never knew existed in such complete form." The preservation of these texts in Ethiopia wasn't accidental or arbitrary. Ethiopian Orthodox theology developed around the understanding that the full revelation of God couldn't be contained in a limited number of books. The cosmic scope of God's plan required a cosmic literature, and Ethiopia saw itself as the guardian of that complete revelation. When viewed together, the suppressed Gospels and Testaments preserved in Ethiopia present a coherent alternative understanding of Christianity. Christ isn't just the savior of individual souls, he's the cosmic victor who defeated supernatural evil, restored divine order, and established God's kingdom in a creation that had been corrupted by fallen angels and their demonic offspring. This cosmic Christ appears throughout Ethiopian religious art, portrayed not just as a suffering savior but as a triumphant king whose victory extends throughout all levels of creation. The Ethiopian artistic tradition draws heavily from the imagery provided by the suppressed texts, creating visual representations of Christ that exist nowhere else in Christian art. The suppressed Gospels preserved in Ethiopia don't just add details to familiar stories, they preserve an entire understanding of Christianity that was systematically edited out of other traditions. In these ancient texts, we encounter a Christianity that is cosmic in scope, supernatural in its understanding of reality, and African in its preservation. 1,500 feet above the Ethiopian highlands, accessible only by a leather rope climb up a sheer cliff face, stands one of Christianity's most isolated monasteries. Debre Damo has been continuously inhabited by monks for over 1,500 years, and in its ancient libraries lie manuscripts that represent the last surviving copies of texts that once shaped early Christian thought. Brother Tekel Haymanot has spent 40 years as guardian of Debre Damo's manuscript collection. His weathered hands have touched documents that predate the printing press by over 1,000 years, scrolls written on parchment made from the hides of animals that grazed these mountains when Europe was still emerging from the Dark Ages. These books are not just our heritage, they are the heritage of all Christianity. We have kept them safe when others would have destroyed them, preserved them when others forgot them, copied them when time threatened to erase them. The preservation of Ethiopia's biblical manuscripts wasn't a passive process. For centuries, monks worked in shifts to recopy deteriorating texts, ensuring that ancient knowledge wouldn't be lost to time, insects, or decay. Each copy was made with painstaking accuracy, with scribes checking and double-checking every letter, every mark of punctuation, every decorative element. In the 16th century, the Islamic invasion led by Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi, known as Grain the Left-Handed, threatened to destroy Ethiopian Christianity entirely. Monasteries were burned, libraries were torched, and countless manuscripts were lost forever. But in the most remote monasteries, monks risked their lives to hide the most precious texts, burying them in caves, sealing them in walls, carrying them to mountain hideouts that invaders couldn't reach. At Debra Damo and other ancient monasteries, secret chambers still contain manuscripts that were hidden during times of persecution. Some haven't been opened for centuries. Others are only now being carefully examined by scholars who are discovering texts that were thought to have been lost forever. The Italian occupation of Ethiopia from 1936 to 1941 brought a different kind of threat to the manuscript tradition. Italian scholars and officials systematically looted Ethiopian libraries, shipping hundreds of precious manuscripts to European collections. Many of these texts have never been returned, representing a permanent loss to Ethiopian scholarship and world culture. Dr. Getachew Haile, one of the world's leading experts on Ethiopian manuscripts, has spent his career tracking down scattered Ethiopian texts in libraries across Europe and America. His work has revealed the true scope of what was lost during the colonial period and what remains to be discovered in Ethiopian monasteries. Every monastery we visit, we find manuscripts that scholars thought were lost. The Ethiopian monks didn't just preserve books. They preserved entire traditions of Christian thought that would have disappeared without their dedication. Today, Ethiopia's manuscript heritage faces new threats. Climate change is affecting the highland monasteries where most texts are preserved. Political instability has made some regions inaccessible to scholars. Urban development threatens monasteries that have stood for over a millennium. The Ethiopian Manuscript Digitization Project, supported by international scholars and Ethiopian institutions, is racing to preserve these ancient texts in digital form. High-resolution photography and advanced imaging techniques are revealing details in manuscripts that have been hidden for centuries, including text that has faded beyond normal visibility. Multispectral imaging is uncovering palimpsests, manuscripts where the original text was scraped away and new text written over it. These techniques are revealing earlier versions of biblical texts, showing how the Ethiopian tradition evolved over time and sometimes preserving readings that are closer to the original autographs than any other surviving manuscripts. The preservation work requires unprecedented collaboration between Ethiopian monks, international scholars, and technology specialists. Projects led by institutions like Princeton University, the University of Toronto, and the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library are working directly with Ethiopian monasteries to ensure that this heritage is preserved for future generations. At the same time, Ethiopian monasteries are training new generations of monks in the traditional arts of manuscript preservation and copying. These young guardians are learning not just to read ancient Guizi, but to write it with the same precision and artistry as their predecessors. Some monasteries still prepare parchment using techniques that haven't changed for over 1,000 years. The process of treating animal hides, preparing ink from natural materials, and creating the tools for writing connects contemporary monks directly to the scribes who first preserved these ancient texts. As more Ethiopian manuscripts are studied, scholars are discovering that Ethiopian scribes preserved multiple textual traditions simultaneously. Different monasteries maintain different versions of the same texts, providing modern scholars with unprecedented insight into how ancient texts were transmitted and modified over time. His Holiness Abune Matthias, Patriarch of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, emphasizes the sacred responsibility that comes with guardianship of these texts. We are not just preserving books, we are preserving the Word of God as it was given to our fathers. This is not just Ethiopian heritage, it is Christian heritage, human heritage. The global significance of Ethiopian manuscript preservation is becoming increasingly clear to biblical scholars worldwide. Professor Emanuel Fritsch of the University of Toronto notes, Ethiopian manuscripts are changing our understanding of early Christianity. They preserve textual traditions that are sometimes centuries older than anything we have in Greek or Latin. The monasteries are also opening their doors to carefully managed scholarly visits, sharing their knowledge with researchers from around the world while maintaining the security and sanctity of their collections. These exchanges are creating new partnerships between Ethiopian monasticism and international scholarship. The combination of traditional monastic preservation methods with cutting-edge digital technology is creating a model for manuscript preservation that other institutions are beginning to adopt. The Ethiopian approach, which combines reverent care with scholarly accessibility, may represent the future of ancient text preservation. The Ethiopian monks who have spent centuries guarding these texts understood something that the modern world is only beginning to appreciate. The preservation of ancient knowledge requires not just technology, but dedication, sacrifice, and an understanding that some truths are worth protecting even at the cost of one's life. In academic conferences from Harvard to Oxford, from Jerusalem to Cairo, biblical scholars are grappling with a revolution in their understanding of early Christianity. The catalyst for this transformation isn't a new archaeological discovery or a recently developed dating technique. It's the ancient manuscripts that Ethiopian monks have been quietly preserving for over 15 centuries. Dr. Steve Delamarter of Willamette University has spent over 2 decades studying Ethiopian biblical manuscripts, and his findings are reshaping fundamental assumptions about Christian origins. Using advanced digital imaging techniques, he's uncovered evidence that some Ethiopian biblical texts preserve readings that are centuries older than any other surviving manuscripts. What we're finding in Ethiopian manuscripts isn't just alternative readings, it's evidence of textual traditions that were edited out of other biblical traditions. In some cases, Ethiopian manuscripts preserve what may be the original readings that were later modified elsewhere. The implications extend far beyond textual criticism. Ethiopian manuscripts preserve complete theological traditions that were partially or completely suppressed in other forms of Christianity. The cosmic Christianity found in texts like the Book of Enoch, the Testament of Abraham, and the books of Adam and Eve represents not a deviation from early Christian thought, but a preservation of it. Recent archaeological discoveries are providing independent confirmation of historical claims found in Ethiopian texts. Excavations at sites mentioned in the Book of Enoch have revealed evidence of sophisticated pre-flood civilizations. Ancient astronomical observations that match descriptions in Ethiopian manuscripts are being found in archaeological contexts across the ancient Near East. Carbon dating, DNA analysis of parchment, and chemical analysis of inks are confirming the antiquity of Ethiopian manuscripts. Some texts that scholars assumed were medieval compositions are proving to be copies of much older originals, possibly dating to the first centuries of Christianity. The first international conference on Ethiopian Christianity, held at Princeton University, brought together scholars from 6 continents to assess the global significance of Ethiopian biblical manuscripts. The consensus was clear: Ethiopian Christianity preserves elements of early Christian thought that exist nowhere else in such complete form. But this revolution in understanding isn't being welcomed everywhere. Traditional Christian institutions, both academic and ecclesiastical, are struggling to accommodate evidence that challenges long-held assumptions about biblical formation and early Christian development. Dr. Emmanuel Tove, one of the world's leading biblical scholars, acknowledges the challenge. Ethiopian manuscripts are forcing us to reconsider fundamental assumptions about how the Bible was formed, what early Christians believed, and how different Christian traditions developed. It's uncomfortable, but it's necessary scholarship. For Ethiopian Orthodox Christians, This scholarly validation of their textual tradition represents vindication of beliefs they've maintained for centuries despite external skepticism. Seminary students who once had to defend the authenticity of their biblical tradition against Western scholarly criticism now find themselves at the center of cutting-edge biblical research. The revolution is fostering unprecedented collaboration between Ethiopian scholars and international researchers. Joint projects are analyzing Ethiopian manuscripts using the most advanced available techniques while respecting the religious and cultural context in which these texts have been preserved. The Ethiopian Manuscript Imaging Project has created high-resolution digital copies of thousands of manuscripts, making them accessible to researchers worldwide while protecting the originals from handling damage. These digital collections are revealing textual relationships and traditions that were previously impossible to study comprehensively. Theological seminaries around the world are beginning to incorporate Ethiopian textual traditions into their curricula. Students preparing for Christian ministry are learning about forms of Christianity that their predecessors never knew existed. The scholarly revolution is beginning to reach popular audiences through books, documentaries, and media coverage. The story of Ethiopian Christianity's preservation of ancient texts is capturing public imagination and challenging popular assumptions about Christian origins. However, not all Christian authorities are embracing these discoveries. Some denominations are resisting the inclusion of Ethiopian textual evidence in biblical scholarship, arguing that it threatens established doctrinal positions and ecclesiastical authority. His Holiness Abune Matthias addresses these concerns directly. Truth doesn't threaten faith, it strengthens it. Ethiopian Christianity doesn't challenge other Christian traditions, it completes them. We've preserved what was lost, maintained what was abandoned, protected what was threatened. Archaeological discoveries continue to provide support for historical claims found in Ethiopian texts. Recent excavations in Yemen have uncovered evidence supporting the historical existence of the Sabaean kingdom described in the Kebra Nagast. Finds in ancient Aksum continue to reveal the sophistication of early Ethiopian civilization. Genetic studies of ancient and modern populations are providing evidence for the historical connections between Ethiopia and the ancient Middle East described in Ethiopian texts. While these studies can't prove specific genealogical claims, they do support the general pattern of ancient connections described in texts like the Kebra Nagast. The revolution in understanding sparked by Ethiopian manuscripts is still in its early stages. Thousands of manuscripts remain unstudied in Ethiopian monasteries. Advanced imaging techniques are continuing to reveal previously invisible text in manuscripts that have been studied for decades. A new generation of scholars is being trained specifically in Ethiopian textual traditions, ensuring that this field of study will continue to grow and develop. These researchers bring both traditional philological skills and cutting-edge technological capabilities to their work. Perhaps most significantly, the Ethiopian manuscript revolution is fostering new dialogue between different Christian traditions. Ancient texts that were once points of division are becoming opportunities for understanding and collaboration between Christians from different backgrounds. In contemporary Ethiopian Orthodox worship, ancient texts continue to play the same central role they've maintained for centuries. Prayers based on the Book of Enoch, liturgies incorporating the Testament of Abraham, and ceremonies reflecting the cosmic Christianity preserved in Ethiopian manuscripts demonstrate the living continuity of this ancient tradition. The revolution of understanding sparked by Ethiopian biblical manuscripts isn't just changing how scholars think about Christian origins, it's changing how Christians understand themselves. In the ancient texts preserved by Ethiopian monks, we're not just discovering alternative versions of familiar stories, we're encountering forms of Christianity that may be closer to the original than anything we've known before. The Ethiopian Bible didn't just preserve ancient books, it preserved an ancient understanding of who Jesus Christ was, where he came from, and what his mission on earth truly entailed. In its pages, we find not just the Jesus of history or the Christ of faith, but the cosmic Son of Man whose story began before creation and whose victory extends throughout all levels of reality. The question facing contemporary Christianity isn't whether these texts are authentic. Scholars have confirmed their antiquity and significance. The question is whether modern believers are prepared for the cosmic Christ that Ethiopian Christianity has preserved for over 15 centuries. Deep in the mountains of Ethiopia, where Christianity has flourished for over 1,600 years, lies a secret that has the power to revolutionize our understanding of Jesus Christ himself. Here, in the ancient monasteries of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, monks have guarded the world's most complete Bible, a collection of sacred texts that contains 15 books deliberately excluded from every other Christian tradition on earth. While the Western world knows a Bible of 66 books, and the Eastern Orthodox traditions recognize 72 to 76, the Ethiopian Orthodox Bible contains 81 books. These aren't recent additions or medieval fabrications. These are ancient texts, some predating the commonly accepted Gospels, preserved in Guizi, one of the world's oldest written languages. The question that haunts biblical scholars today is not whether these books are authentic. Carbon dating and linguistic analysis have confirmed their antiquity. The question is why they were removed from other biblical canons, and what truths about Jesus Christ they contain that early church leaders deemed too dangerous for the faithful to know. Among these forbidden books are texts that completely reshape our understanding of Jesus' origins, his mission, and his true nature. The Book of Enoch, considered so important that the New Testament Book of Jude quotes it directly, exists in its complete form only in Ethiopian manuscripts. The Book of Jubilees provides an alternative chronology of biblical events that challenges accepted timelines. The Kebra Nagast tells the story of a royal bloodline connecting Ethiopia directly to King Solomon and, through him, to Jesus Christ himself. These books were systematically excluded from the biblical canon during the early centuries of Christianity, particularly after the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. Church fathers like Saint Jerome declared them apocryphal, hidden or secret, and relegated them to the shadows of Christian history. But why? What did these ancient texts reveal about Jesus Christ that made them so threatening to the emerging institutional church? The Ethiopian Orthodox Church never accepted these exclusions. For them, these books weren't apocryphal, they were essential. Ethiopian Christianity, which claims to predate the conversion of Rome by several decades, maintained that these texts contained vital truths about the nature of Christ, the history of salvation, and humanity's true origins that had been deliberately suppressed. Today, as scholars gain unprecedented access to these ancient Ethiopian manuscripts, they're discovering that the excluded books don't just add colorful details to familiar stories, they fundamentally alter our understanding of who Jesus was, where he came from, and what his mission on earth truly entailed. These texts speak of fallen angels and their hybrid offspring, of pre-flood civilizations of incredible sophistication, of Jesus as the fulfillment of prophecies that appear nowhere in the standard biblical canon. The preservation of these texts in Ethiopia wasn't accidental. Ethiopian monks risked their lives to maintain these manuscripts through Islamic invasions, European colonization, and centuries of persecution. They understood themselves to be guardians of truths that the rest of the Christian world had lost or abandoned. Dr. Michael Knibb of King's College London, one of the world's leading experts on the Ethiopian Bible, puts it succinctly: the Ethiopian biblical tradition preserves elements of early Christian thought that were edited out of other traditions. These aren't alternative interpretations, they're original interpretations that were later suppressed. The implications are staggering. If these Ethiopian texts are authentic records of early Christian belief, then our understanding of Jesus Christ has been filtered through nearly 2 millennia of institutional editing. The Ethiopian Bible doesn't just add to the story of Christianity, it suggests that the story itself has been fundamentally altered. As we journey through the forbidden books of the Ethiopian Bible, we'll discover a Jesus whose origins stretch back to the very foundations of the world, whose mission was understood in cosmic terms that dwarf the familiar narratives of redemption and salvation. We'll encounter prophecies that predate the Gospels, bloodlines that connect the Holy Land to the Horn of Africa, and revelations about the nature of divinity itself that were deemed too dangerous for ordinary believers to know. The Ethiopian Bible doesn't just preserve alternative Christian texts, it preserves an alternative Christianity, one that challenges everything we thought we knew about the origins of our most sacred stories. The question is no longer whether these books are authentic. The question is whether we're ready for the truths they contain. And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. These cryptic words from Genesis are all that most Christians know about one of the Bible's most mysterious figures. But what if Enoch left behind a detailed account of his divine encounters? What if his testimony about the origins of evil, the nature of angels, and the coming of the Messiah was preserved in its entirety, but deliberately hidden from the world? In the monasteries of Ethiopia, the complete Book of Enoch has been preserved for over 2,000 years. This isn't a fragment or a reconstruction. It's a 108-chapter epic that reveals the cosmic context of human history and provides the most detailed account of Jesus Christ's true origins found anywhere in ancient literature. The Book of Enoch begins with a revelation that fundamentally alters our understanding of human history. According to Enoch's testimony, 200 divine beings called Watchers, angels assigned to observe humanity, violated their sacred duty and descended to earth. Led by beings named Azazel and Semjaza, these fallen angels took human wives and taught humanity forbidden knowledge: metallurgy, astronomy, cosmetics, and warfare. The offspring of these unions were giants called the Nephilim, beings of immense stature and power who dominated the ancient world. But Enoch's account goes beyond the familiar story of fallen angels. He describes a pre-flood civilization of staggering sophistication, where the Nephilim built cities, developed technologies, and ruled over humanity with supernatural power. The Book of Enoch contains astronomical knowledge that wouldn't be rediscovered by European science for over a millennium. It describes the movement of celestial bodies, the changing of seasons, and the structure of the heavens with mathematical precision. This wasn't primitive mythology, it was advanced scientific knowledge preserved in religious language. But the most revolutionary aspect of Enoch's testimony concerns his prophecies about the coming Messiah. Centuries before the Gospels were written, Enoch described in vivid detail the arrival of the Son of Man, a divine being who would judge the world and establish God's kingdom on earth. The parallels to Jesus' own words in the Gospels are unmistakable, because Jesus was directly quoting from Enoch. The New Testament book of Jude explicitly quotes from Enoch, calling him a prophet and citing his prophecies about divine judgment. This means that the early Christian church not only knew about the Book of Enoch, they considered it authoritative scripture. Yet somehow, this crucial text was removed from the biblical canon in most Christian traditions. The exclusion of Enoch from the Bible wasn't based on questions of authenticity or antiquity. Early church fathers like Clement of Alexandria and Origen considered it inspired scripture. The problem was theological. Enoch's detailed account of fallen angels and their hybrid offspring was deemed too disturbing for ordinary believers. The book's cosmic scope and supernatural complexity didn't fit the simplified narrative that institutional Christianity was developing. In Ethiopia, however, the Book of Enoch remained central to Christian understanding. Ethiopian theology embraced the cosmic drama that Enoch described, seeing Jesus Christ as the promised Son of Man who would defeat the Nephilim and their demonic overlords once and for all. This wasn't metaphorical language, it was literal history. Contemporary research has validated many of Enoch's astronomical observations. His descriptions of celestial mechanics, seasonal changes, and stellar movements demonstrate knowledge that would have been impossible for a Bronze Age author to possess through normal means. Either Enoch was one of history's greatest astronomical geniuses, or his claim to have received divine revelation about the structure of the universe was literally true. The Book of Enoch also provides context for the mysterious megalithic structures found across the ancient world. The precision-cut stones of Baalbek, the massive blocks of Sacsayhuaman, the technical sophistication of the Great Pyramid. Enoch suggests these weren't built by primitive humans with simple tools. They were constructed by the Nephilim, using knowledge taught by fallen angels. The discovery of Enoch fragments among the Dead Sea Scrolls confirmed that Jewish communities in Jesus' time considered the book sacred scripture. The Essenes, who preserved the Dead Sea Scrolls, treated Enoch as canonical. This means that Jesus himself would have known and studied the book of Enoch, and his references to himself as the Son of Man were deliberate connections to Enoch's prophecies. For Ethiopian Christians, Jesus Christ isn't just a Jewish rabbi who became the savior of humanity. He's the cosmic Son of Man prophesied by Enoch, the divine warrior who came to earth to defeat the fallen angels and their monstrous offspring. His crucifixion wasn't just about human sin, it was the climactic battle in a supernatural war that began before the flood. This understanding transforms the entire narrative of Christianity. Jesus' temptation in the wilderness becomes a direct confrontation with the demonic powers that have corrupted humanity since the time of the Watchers. His exorcisms aren't just healings, they're military operations in a cosmic war. His resurrection isn't just victory over death, it's proof that the Son of Man has defeated the supernatural forces that enslaved humanity. The Book of Enoch ends with a vision of the New Jerusalem that closely parallels the Book of Revelation. But Enoch's version provides crucial details about the nature of Christ's eternal kingdom and the final fate of the Nephilim and their demonic fathers. It's a cosmic resolution to a cosmic conflict that began in the earliest days of human history. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved the Book of Enoch because they understood a fundamental truth that other Christian traditions chose to forget. The story of Jesus Christ cannot be understood apart from the cosmic drama that Enoch witnessed. Christ didn't come just to save humanity from sin, he came to liberate creation itself from supernatural tyranny. In the heart of Ethiopia stands the Church of St. George in Lalibela, carved from a single piece of volcanic rock in the shape of a perfect cross. Local tradition claims it was built by angels in a single night. But this architectural miracle represents something far more significant. It's evidence of an Ethiopian Christianity that developed independently of European influence, preserving unique traditions about Jesus Christ that exist nowhere else on earth. Walk into any Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and you'll encounter images that challenge conventional depictions of Christ. Here, Jesus is portrayed with African features, surrounded by Ethiopian saints and angels. These aren't modern adaptations, they're ancient artistic traditions based on Ethiopian beliefs about Christ's actual appearance and his connections to the African continent. Ethiopian Christianity claims a direct connection to Jesus that predates European conversion by decades. According to the Acts of the Apostles, Philip the Evangelist baptized an Ethiopian eunuch who was treasurer to Queen Candace of Ethiopia. This official, traveling from Jerusalem to Ethiopia, represents the first recorded conversion of an African to Christianity, and it happened during the lifetime of Christ's original apostles. But Ethiopian traditions claim an even deeper connection. The Kebra Nagast, Ethiopia's most sacred text after the Bible, tells the story of the Queen of Sheba's journey to meet King Solomon. Unlike the brief biblical account, the Ethiopian version provides extensive details about this encounter, including the birth of a son, Menelik I, who would become the founder of the Ethiopian royal dynasty. According to Ethiopian tradition, this royal bloodline connects Ethiopia directly to the house of David through King Solomon. Since Jesus Christ is described in the Gospels as a descendant of David, this makes the Ethiopian royal family distant relatives of Christ himself. For over 2 millennia, Ethiopian emperors claimed the title Lion of Judah, based on this genealogical connection. Ethiopian Orthodox traditions also preserve accounts of Jesus' travels that don't appear in the canonical Gospels. During the lost years between his childhood temple visit and the beginning of his ministry, Ethiopian sources claim that Jesus traveled extensively throughout Africa, including a significant period in Ethiopia itself. These traditions aren't merely religious speculation. Archaeological evidence supports the existence of sophisticated Jewish communities in ancient Ethiopia, complete with synagogues, ritual baths, and religious schools. The Beta Israel, Ethiopian Jews who practiced Judaism for over 2 millennia in isolation from other Jewish communities, maintain traditions and customs that scholars believe may preserve aspects of pre-temple Judaism. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church practices forms of Christianity that appear nowhere else in the world. Their liturgical calendar includes observances based on the Book of Enoch. They maintain dietary laws similar to those of ancient Judaism. They practice circumcision and observe Saturday as well as Sunday as holy days. These aren't borrowings from other traditions, they're indigenous Ethiopian practices that suggest a form of Christianity closer to its Jewish roots. Perhaps most remarkably, Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity claims to possess the original Ark of the Covenant. According to the Kebra Nagast, Menelik I brought the Ark from Jerusalem to Ethiopia, where it has been kept in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum for over 2,500 years. While outsiders are forbidden from viewing the Ark, Ethiopian Christians believe its presence in their land demonstrates God's special covenant with Ethiopia. Historical evidence supports Ethiopia's early adoption of Christianity. Ethiopian coins from the 4th century CE bear Christian symbols, making Ethiopia one of the first nations to officially adopt Christianity as a state religion. King Izana of Aksum converted to Christianity around 330 CE, nearly contemporary with Constantine's conversion in Rome. Ethiopian Christian art depicts Jesus in ways that emphasize his cosmic significance rather than his historical humanity. Christ appears as the eternal Logos, the divine word through whom all creation came into being. These representations draw heavily from the Book of Enoch's descriptions of the Son of Man as a pre-existent divine being who participated in creation itself. Even Ethiopian crosses are unique, incorporating symbolic elements that don't appear in other Christian traditions. The intricate geometric patterns represent not just Christ's crucifixion, but the cosmic order that he established through his victory over the forces of chaos and evil described in the Book of Enoch. Ethiopian Orthodox theology developed independently of the major theological controversies that shaped European Christianity. While Western Christianity debated the nature of Christ's divinity and humanity, Ethiopian Christianity maintained traditions that may preserve earlier understandings of Christ's nature that were later modified by institutional churches. The differences are striking. While European Christianity emphasized Christ's role as savior from sin, Ethiopian Christianity emphasizes his role as cosmic victor over supernatural evil. While Western theology focused on individual salvation, Ethiopian theology maintained the cosmic perspective found in the Book of Enoch, seeing Christ's work as the restoration of divine order to a creation corrupted by fallen angels. These theological differences aren't academic curiosities, they represent alternative understandings of Christianity that were preserved in Ethiopia while being modified or abandoned elsewhere. Ethiopian Orthodox scholars argue that their traditions may preserve aspects of apostolic Christianity that were later changed by institutional developments in other churches. Today, Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity represents the largest non-Chalcedonian Christian church in the world, with over 50 million members. Their preservation of ancient texts, unique theological traditions, and distinctive liturgical practices provides a window into early Christianity that exists nowhere else. The Ethiopian Jesus isn't just a culturally adapted version of a familiar figure. He's a representation of Christ that may be closer to the original apostolic understanding than the versions that developed in Europe and Asia. In Ethiopia, Christianity didn't just adapt to local culture. It preserved elements of the original that were lost elsewhere. Now when the Queen of Sheba heard of the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to prove him with hard questions. This single verse from 1 Kings is all that most people know about one of history's most intriguing encounters. But in Ethiopia, this meeting is remembered as the beginning of a love story that would reshape the spiritual geography of the world. The Kebra Nagast, The Glory of the Kings, is Ethiopia's national epic, a text so central to Ethiopian identity that every emperor was required to own a copy. Written in Guizi but drawing from much older oral traditions, it tells the complete story of the Queen of Sheba's relationship with King Solomon and its profound consequences for both Israel and Ethiopia. According to the Kebra Nagast, the Queen of Sheba, known in Ethiopia as Queen Makeda, ruled over a vast kingdom that included much of what is now Ethiopia, Yemen, and southern Arabia. She was renowned not just for her wealth and wisdom, but for her spiritual seeking. When reports of Solomon's divinely inspired wisdom reached her, she undertook the arduous journey to Jerusalem not merely as a diplomatic mission, but as a spiritual quest. The Ethiopian account of their meeting goes far beyond the biblical version. The Kebra Nagast describes intimate theological discussions between Makeda and Solomon, debates about the nature of God, wisdom, and justice that lasted for months. Solomon was struck not just by Makeda's beauty, but by her spiritual insight and her genuine desire to understand divine truth. What the Bible only hints at, the Kebra Nagast makes explicit. Solomon and Makeda became lovers. But this wasn't merely a royal romance, it was understood as a divinely orchestrated union that would have cosmic significance. Their son, Menelik I, would become the founder of a dynasty that would rule Ethiopia for over 2,500 years, claiming direct descent from King David and, through him, kinship with Jesus Christ himself. The genealogical claims of the Kebra Nagast are staggering in their implications. If Menelik I was indeed the son of Solomon and Makeda, then the Ethiopian Solomonic dynasty represents the oldest continuously ruling bloodline in human history, and the only royal family that can trace its ancestry directly to the biblical King David. This would make Ethiopian emperors distant cousins of Jesus Christ. But the most dramatic claim of the Kebra Nagast concerns the Ark of the Covenant itself. According to the text, when Menelik came of age, he traveled to Jerusalem to meet his father. Solomon, recognizing his son's wisdom and spiritual authority, secretly arranged for the ark to be taken from the temple and transported to Ethiopia, where it would be safer from the political turmoil that was beginning to engulf Israel. The Kebra Nagast describes the removal of the ark not as theft, but as divine providence. The text claims that God himself commanded the transfer, recognizing that Ethiopia had become the true inheritor of the covenant originally made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The spiritual center of the world was shifting from Jerusalem to Aksum. For over 2 millennia, Ethiopian Orthodox Christians have believed that the original Ark of the Covenant rests in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Aksum. A single monk, known as the Guardian, is charged with protecting the Ark, and no one else is permitted to see it. While skeptics dismiss this claim, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church maintains that the presence of the Ark in Ethiopia demonstrates God's special covenant with their nation. The theological implications of the Kebra Nagast shaped Ethiopian Christianity for centuries. Every Ethiopian emperor was crowned in ceremonies that explicitly connected them to Solomon, David, and ultimately to Christ himself. The title Lion of Judah wasn't merely ceremonial, it represented a claim to participate in the messianic lineage that produced Jesus. Modern scholarship has found intriguing correlations between the genealogies preserved in the Kebra Nagast and those found in biblical and extra-biblical sources. While the specific claims about Solomon and Makeda cannot be independently verified, the text preserves historical information about ancient Ethiopian dynasties and their connections to Arabian and Middle Eastern kingdoms that has proven remarkably accurate. Archaeological evidence from Aksum supports the existence of a sophisticated ancient kingdom with extensive trade connections to the Mediterranean world. Aksumite coins, monuments, and artifacts demonstrate a level of cultural and technological development that aligns with the descriptions in the Kebra Nagast of a wealthy and powerful Ethiopian kingdom in ancient times. Inscriptions in ancient Sabaean script found in both Ethiopia and Yemen provide evidence for the historical existence of the kingdoms described in the Kebra Nagast. These texts reference rulers and dynasties that correspond to figures mentioned in the Ethiopian epic, suggesting that the core historical framework of the story may be based on actual events. For Ethiopian Orthodox theologians, the Kebra Nagast isn't just a national epic, It's a theological treatise that explains Ethiopia's unique role in salvation history. The transfer of the Ark from Jerusalem to Aksum represents God's choice of Ethiopia as the guardian of true religion, a responsibility that the Ethiopian Church has maintained through centuries of challenge and persecution. The Ethiopian version of the Queen of Sheba story exists alongside similar traditions in Jewish, Islamic, and other Christian sources, but the Kebra Nagast provides by far the most detailed and theologically developed account. Its emphasis on the spiritual and genealogical connections between Ethiopia and Israel appears nowhere else in ancient literature. The influence of the Kebra Nagast extends far beyond historical claims. Ethiopian Orthodox liturgy includes prayers and ceremonies that reference the events described in the text. The annual Timkat celebration, commemorating Jesus' baptism, explicitly connects Ethiopian Christianity to the Solomonic heritage described in the Kebra Nagast. The global influence of the Kebra Nagast extends even beyond Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity. The Rastafarian movement, founded in Jamaica in the 1930s, drew heavily from the text's claims about Ethiopian royal divinity, seeing Emperor Haile Selassie as the fulfillment of biblical prophecies about the Lion of Judah. Whether viewed as literal history or sacred mythology, the Kebra Nagast preserves a vision of Christianity that is fundamentally African, fundamentally royal, and fundamentally connected to the cosmic drama of salvation. In its pages, Ethiopia isn't a peripheral participant in biblical history, it's the ultimate inheritor of God's covenant with humanity. Deep within the stone walls of Ethiopian monasteries lie books that would shake the foundations of Christianity as the world knows it. These aren't just alternative gospels. They're complete theological universes that predate many Western Christian texts by centuries. The Book of Adam and Eve, known in Ethiopia as Conflict of Adam and Eve with Satan, doesn't simply retell the Garden of Eden story, it explodes it into an epic 3,000-year saga. While Western Christianity reduced humanity's first parents to a brief cautionary tale, Ethiopian scribes preserved a sweeping narrative where Adam and Eve battled demonic forces across millennia, receive prophetic visions of Christ's coming, and engage in theological debates that would make medieval scholars weep with envy. Consider this: while European monks were copying Latin translations of translations, Ethiopian scholars were working directly from Guizi texts that claimed apostolic origins. The Testament of Abraham, lost to Western Christianity for over a millennium, survived intact in Ethiopian libraries. This isn't merely a different version, it's a completely different theological framework. The Ethiopian understanding of Jesus' divine nature cuts through centuries of European theological warfare. While Rome and Constantinople split over whether Christ had one nature or two, Ethiopian Christianity had already synthesized these concepts through their preservation of early Alexandrian theology. Their Tuahido doctrine, meaning being made one, predates the Council of Chalcedon by decades, yet offers solutions to Christological problems that still perplex theologians today. But here's where it gets revolutionary. These Ethiopian texts don't just preserve alternative viewpoints, they preserve earlier viewpoints. The books of Enoch, completely lost to Western Christianity until the 18th century, had been continuously studied in Ethiopian monasteries for 1,500 years. While European scholars debated angels dancing on pinheads, Ethiopian theologians were analyzing detailed angelic hierarchies preserved from Second Temple Judaism. Compare this to the Gnostic Gospels discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945. Western scholars hailed these as revolutionary discoveries that challenged Christian orthodoxy. Yet Ethiopian Christians had been reading far more extensive collections of early Christian literature for centuries. The difference? Ethiopian texts weren't buried in desert caves. They were living documents, copied and recopied by monks who understood their theological significance. Why did early church fathers consider these books dangerous? Because they democratized divine knowledge. The Ethiopian texts suggested that ordinary believers could achieve direct mystical experiences with God, no institutional mediation required. They contained detailed instructions for spiritual practices, prophetic techniques, and theological interpretations that bypassed episcopal authority entirely. Augustine himself warned against books that lead simple minds astray with their detailed descriptions of heavenly mysteries. He wasn't worried about theological accuracy, he was worried about theological accessibility. These texts made every believer a potential mystic, every monastery a potential rival to Rome's emerging supremacy. The books of Adam and Eve contained explicit prophecies about multiple messiahs, not just one. The Testament of Abraham described post-mortem negotiations with God that suggested salvation wasn't exclusively through institutional Christianity. For church fathers building a unified, hierarchical institution, these were more than alternative viewpoints, they were existential threats. What makes this suppression even more tragic is that these weren't fringe documents. They were mainstream Christian literature in the Christianity that existed before Rome conquered it, before Constantine weaponized it, before European colonialism exported its particular version globally as if it were the only authentic Christianity that had ever existed. Fortresses, not built to keep armies out but to keep knowledge in. For over 1,500 years, Debra Damo Monastery has been Christianity's most successful library, preserving texts that the rest of the Christian world had forgotten, abandoned, or actively destroyed. The only way up is a leather rope. No women allowed, ever, not from misogyny, but from an ancient understanding that this isolation was the only way to preserve what they guarded. These weren't just books, they were the last copies on earth of Christianity's original theological diversity. The monks who scaled those ropes carried more than their own bodies. They carried copying materials, binding supplies, and an absolutely unshakable conviction that what they preserved was worth dying for. And die they did by the hundreds to keep these texts alive. When Islamic armies swept across North Africa in the 7th century, they weren't just conquering territory, they were reshaping the intellectual landscape of Christianity. Alexandria's great library, once Christianity's theological powerhouse, was dismantled. Coptic monasteries were abandoned. Centuries of Christian scholarship disappeared almost overnight. But Ethiopia's geography became its salvation. The highland monasteries weren't just difficult to reach, they were nearly impossible to conquer. While Islamic armies could take cities and coastal regions, they couldn't sustain siege warfare at 12,000 feet above sea level. The monks of Debra Damo and dozens of other highland monasteries became Christianity's inadvertent special forces, conducting what amounted to a 1,400-year covert operation to preserve forbidden knowledge. Then came a different kind of threat. Italian fascists in the 1930s weren't interested in theology, they wanted to break Ethiopian cultural identity entirely. Mussolini's forces specifically targeted monasteries, understanding that Ethiopia's resistance was as much intellectual as military. The monks of Debra Damo watched Italian planes circle their cliff, knowing that a single bombing run could destroy irreplaceable manuscripts dating back to the 4th century. So they did what their predecessors had done for centuries, they disappeared the books. Manuscripts were wrapped in leather, sealed in pottery, and hidden in caves that only the monks knew existed. Some texts spent decades in underground chambers while their guardians died of old age, carrying location secrets to their graves. Today, Ethiopian scholars estimate that thousands of manuscripts remain hidden, waiting for political stability that might never come. The Marxist Derg regime brought the most systematic persecution in Ethiopian Christian history. These weren't foreign invaders who might be repelled. These were Ethiopians who viewed the monasteries as obstacles to revolutionary progress. Monks were imprisoned, manuscripts were publicly burned, and centuries-old libraries were converted into grain storage. But the monks had learned. By the time Derg soldiers reached Debra Damo, they found mostly empty shelves. The real treasures had been redistributed to dozens of smaller monasteries, buried in locations known only to abbots who communicated through coded messages that looked like ordinary religious correspondence. Today, Ethiopian and international scholars are racing against time and political instability to digitize what remains accessible. The Hill Museum and Manuscript Library has digitized over 20,000 Ethiopian manuscripts, but scholars estimate this represents less than half of what survives. Every political crisis, every conflict, every year of continued instability means more irreplaceable texts lost forever. What they're discovering defies every assumption about early Christian development. Manuscripts that shouldn't exist according to European church history. Theological arguments that supposedly died out in the 3rd century, but were still being actively debated in 15th century Ethiopia. Complete books of the Bible that Western Christianity declared apocryphal, but Ethiopian Christianity never stopped considering canonical. The monks of Debre Damo weren't just preserving books. They were preserving entire alternative histories of what Christianity could have become if Rome hadn't conquered it, if European colonialism hadn't exported one narrow version as universal truth, if the theological diversity of early Christianity had been allowed to flourish rather than being systematically suppressed. Every manuscript they saved is evidence of roads not taken, of Christian possibilities that the world was told never existed. The story they taught in Western seminaries went like this. Christianity began in Palestine, developed in Greece, matured in Rome, and was perfected in Europe before being charitably exported to the rest of the world. Ethiopia was a footnote, an exotic curiosity that somehow managed to maintain a primitive version of the faith despite its isolation from civilized Christian development. That story is about to be completely rewritten. In 2008, archaeologists working in Aksum made a discovery that shattered comfortable assumptions about early Christianity. They didn't find a church, they found the church. A 4th century cathedral complex that predates most European Christian architecture by centuries, containing inscriptions that prove Ethiopian Christianity wasn't a late import from Roman missions, but a parallel development that might actually predate Roman Christianity's institutional consolidation. The inscriptions aren't in Latin or Greek, they're in Guizi, Ethiopia's ancient liturgical language. But here's what makes Western scholars uncomfortable. These inscriptions contain theological formulations that European Christianity supposedly invented centuries later. Ethiopian Christians were articulating sophisticated Trinitarian theology before the Council of Nicaea, developing monasticism before it appeared in Egypt, and preserving biblical texts that wouldn't resurface in Europe until the Renaissance. Dr. Getachew Haile, arguably the world's leading expert on Ethiopian manuscripts, has spent 5 decades proving that Ethiopian biblical scholarship isn't just different from European Christianity, it's older. His translations of previously unknown Ethiopian texts have forced Western scholars to acknowledge that their entire timeline of Christian development was based on the false assumption that if Europeans didn't know about something, it didn't exist. The resistance from traditional Christian institutions has been swift and vicious. When Ethiopian scholars began presenting evidence that their biblical canon includes books that Western Christianity rejected, European and American theologians didn't engage the evidence. They attacked the credibility of Ethiopian scholarship itself. African biblical interpretation was dismissed as syncretistic, primitive, or corrupted by local influences. But the manuscripts don't lie. Carbon dating doesn't care about institutional pride. Archaeological evidence doesn't respect theological comfort zones. The Ethiopian Bible contains 81 books compared to the Protestant Bible's 66. But these aren't late additions, they're early preservations. The books of Enoch, Jubilees, and the Testament of Abraham exist in Ethiopian manuscripts that predate their discovery by European scholars by half a millennium. The question isn't why Ethiopian Christianity added these books, it's why European Christianity removed them. Modern genetic research is providing even more uncomfortable evidence. Studies of Ethiopian Jewish populations suggest that the connection between Ethiopia and ancient Israel isn't legendary, it's genetic. Ethiopian Christians and Ethiopian Jews share Middle Eastern genetic markers that support ancient migration patterns, not medieval conversion stories. This means Ethiopian claims about preserving original Judeo-Christian traditions aren't cultural mythology, they're potentially verifiable historical fact. When confronted with this evidence, traditional Christian institutions have deployed what can only be called academic colonialism. Ethiopian interpretations are interesting but not authoritative. Ethiopian manuscripts are valuable for understanding regional variations, not universal Christianity. Ethiopian theology is worth studying as anthropology, not as serious biblical scholarship. But here's the devastating counterargument. If Ethiopian Christianity preserved more original texts, maintained older theological traditions, and developed independently of Roman institutional corruption, then maybe Ethiopian Christianity isn't a regional variation of real Christianity. Maybe European Christianity is a regional variation of Ethiopian Christianity. The implications go far beyond academic theology. If Ethiopian biblical scholarship represents older, more authentic Christian traditions, then the Christianity that colonized Africa, Asia, and the Americas wasn't bringing the true faith to the heathens. It was imposing a newer, more institutionally corrupted version of Christianity on cultures that might have had access to older, more authentic versions all along. The revolution isn't coming, it's already here. Every newly digitized Ethiopian manuscript, every archaeological discovery in Aksum, every genetic study of ancient populations adds more evidence that Christianity's center of gravity was never Rome, never Europe, never the global north that claimed exclusive ownership of Christian truth. The future of biblical scholarship is being written in Guizi, decoded in Ethiopian monasteries, and defended by African scholars who refuse to accept that their Christianity is somehow less authentic than the version that conquered them. For 1,600 years, Ethiopian Christians preserved what the rest of the Christian world lost. Now they're teaching the world what Christianity looked like before Europe claimed to own it. The students are about to become the teachers. And the teachers aren't going to like what they learn.